Hello, this is Abe Chavez, and today we're going to be talking about how to leverage a priori to better collaborate and negotiate with your suppliers. Just a little bit about my background. I spent about 14 years at GE, 10 of which I was at Power Systems in various engineering roles in the gas turbine and steam turbine business. Out of those years, I had 2 years of direct procurement experience as a leader of a commodities business team, responsible for about $50 million of spend of machine components and fabrications. So machine castings, machine forging, sheet metal parts, weldments, things like that. I was also director of product management for a sourcing solution company that was geared at small and medium manufacturers. We produced a software product that included things like electronic auctions and electronic RFQs, electronic catalogs, and things of that sort. And my last job, I actually worked for a machining company that sold machine parts to many of the companies that you would recognize, companies like GE, Air Liquide, Samsung, Dresser-Rand, as well as a host of smaller companies. So we sold impellers, machine diffusers, machine castings, and things of that sort. So I've been on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, on the supplier side and on the buyer side. So today we're going to talk about how aPriori can help you collaborate with your suppliers, and I really do mean collaborate. We're going to talk about what we mean by fact-based negotiations. We always use that term, but I figure it would be worth our while to just spend a little bit of time making sure everybody's on the same page, understanding what we mean by fact-based. And then we're going to get right into it and talk about how to use aPriori to source both existing components and new components, NPI parts. And we'll leave some time at the end for question and answer. So collaborating with your suppliers. How can aPriori help you collaborate with your suppliers? aPriori helps you conduct negotiations with your suppliers to ensure that you purchase each part at a fair price, that you're not overpaying for the part, and that your suppliers are not losing money, which is actually important for both sides. For many years, companies had a typical practice of asking for a specific percentage every year from your supplier. So you would go to your supplier and you would say, I want a 5% reduction in price for everything that I buy from you. And then the next year it would be 6%, and then the following year it would be 4%, and so on and so forth. And the problem with that is that if you continue to do that, sooner or later your suppliers will be losing money on some of the parts that they sell you because they're just going to run out of margin. And to stay profitable, they're going to have to overcharge you for all the items, and that just leads to an adversarial relationship. aPriori helps the situation by helping you identify which parts you actually may be overpaying with and help you focus your efforts only on those components where the supplier will have room to give you some savings. When needed, it also help you source the new parts at a fair price from start. So when you have an NPI part, it will give you an idea of what that part should cost, so you will have a very good target price and negotiate a very good price from the first time you buy that part. aPriori also helps you identify potential design changes that are worth making. We have another session that is called Spend Analytics that talks in much more detail about this. But in essence, aPriori will help you identify and work with your supplier on parts for which you may be paying a fair price, but that they may have indeed some suggestions as to how they could be made differently or designed differently so that they would cost less. It helps you provide your internal customer with initial rough estimates, which in turn reduces the number of quotes that your supplier has to give you for the same part. In many cases, for NPI situations, the supplier has to give you 3 or 4 quotes for the same part along the design process. And so that increases their cost of doing business with you because those first few quotes, the supplier knows he has no chance of getting any business because none will be awarded. If you could generate your own rough estimates based on the design that the engineer has, you will not only accelerate your design cycle time because you don't have to wait for the quote, that would also make it easier for your supplier to do business with you because he doesn't have to quote as many times. And ultimately, aPriori also helps you match the capabilities of your suppliers to the requirements of the part so that you may send your RFQs to the most qualified supplier. What do we mean by fact-based negotiation? Well, aPriori provides you with a very complete set of information regarding the part that you are designing or the part that you have designed. Anything from material costs and labor costs and overhead costs to what tooling investment may be required to manufacture the part, and then also process level costs so that you can understand where those costs went into. This helps you focus your negotiations on the areas where the biggest gaps may be between you and your supplier. And this enhanced information can be used to guide the negotiations with the supplier, and that's what we mean by fact-based negotiation. So how do you use aPriori to do this? aPriori can support a sourcing professional by helping them source different types of things. Anything from new components during the NPI process, which may be components that are completely new, redesigned or designed from scratch, to components that may just be a small variation of the old part. And it may also help with sourcing existing components. Again, identifying those which may be candidates for immediate negotiation and identifying those that may be candidates for perhaps a redesign so that you can lower the cost of the part. So let's begin with how can aPriori help you source existing components, specifically those for which you can negotiate a lower price. The first thing that you have to do is essentially narrow down your targets. Determine the scope of what you're going to negotiate. You can't negotiate everything that you possibly buy. And hence, again, I will point you towards our spend analytics presentation, which talks about this in much more details. But in general, we recommend that you target the items in which you spend the most money because obviously that's where the most opportunity is. When you run these components that you have chosen as candidates for renegotiation, we recommend that you always double check and make sure that when you generated the cost estimates using aPriori, that you use the correct material, the correct volumes, that you added any secondary processes such as paint or polishing or heat treatments and things like that, because you want to have the most adequate cost possible in order to conduct these negotiations. If there are any missing processes that may not be available in your aPriori factory, so let's say that you don't have an X-ray inspection process modeled in your virtual factory, but that you do require it for that part, then you would add that cost to the aPriori total, whatever you believe is inadequate or an estimate of that cost. The thing to remember is your overall number does not have to be exact. It just has to be a very good estimate for you to be able to negotiate. Once you do that, you're going to end up with parts where the estimated cost that aPriori is generating is different than the price that you are paying. We call those outliers, and those are the ones, obviously, that you are going to target for negotiation. Now, sometimes these outliers can have a very, very big difference. Sometimes aPriori might say that you should be paying half the price, or maybe even a quarter or a fifth of the price. And it is very tempting to just say, well, the aPriori estimate must be wrong. You can't be that far away, and it's very, very easy to have a tendency to just dismiss those. But in fact, although it typically it is an indication that something may be missing or that something is not well understood, it is worth finding out what is going on. So what we recommend is that you contact the supplier and find out where that difference is coming from. And I'll give you an example. I was working with a truck manufacturer, 18-wheel trucks, and we came to a roof that aPriori was estimating should cost about half what it was actually being purchased for. When we contacted the supplier, we had a very open conversation and said, we've been analyzing all of our spend, and we have conducted some cost estimate efforts, and we estimated that for this part that we buy from you, we would have some material cost and the stamping cost and the paint cost. But when we add it all together, it doesn't come to nearly as much as we're paying, and we want to understand where the cost is going into. Can you help us understand that? I mean, so it turns out the paint process that was being specified in order to meet the spec, the supplier had to polish that roof. And because it was a concave part, it couldn't be put through just a sander, otherwise, because if they did, they might deform it. It had to be polished by hand, and that added a significant amount of cost. Now, it turns out, obviously, that the supplier was charging the right price. So, yes, the part should cost as much as the supplier was charging. But now the customer knew the reason for that. They went back to engineering and reassessed, the paint spec and what they could do about the paint spec, because it was costing them about $250,000 a year, basically, extra. So that's the type of information that you may learn, that you may find. In other cases, you may find that indeed the supplier made a mistake and that you should be paying half or a quarter of what you were paying. But we'll get to an example of that. Then there are what we call the standard outliers. Those parts for which the price difference between what aPriori estimates and what you pay is, 25, 30, 40%. Now, it is a significant enough difference to be called an outlier. So we again recommend that the first step to take is to discuss with the supplier where the cost might be going into. You may indeed be missing another process, or there may be a very good reason for that difference, but that is where the conversation starts. It's where are the costs going to. If you don't find a reasonable resolution for the cost difference, then you need to investigate the details and begin the process of fact-based negotiation. So if you haven't already done so, many companies ask for a detailed breakdown of the cost right from the start. But if you have not, the first step is to obtain a breakdown of the cost and try to obtain breakdowns by material cost, then the manufacturing cost of the part, the main forming process, any extra machining cost that may have gone into, any tooling cost or fixtures cost, any assembly cost if it's more than just a part, if it's a subcomponent, a sub-assembly. Then any secondary processes that may be perhaps done outside of the company or even inside the company, things like painting or inspections, special inspections, or heat treatment and things like that. And then obviously any transportation costs that they may be charging you for. We want to do that because we want to compare these costs to what aPriori gives you. Now, in many cases, suppliers may not be able to give you this entire breakdown, but they should at least be able to give you a breakdown of the components that I have marked with a star here. Virtually all suppliers, and I've been on the supplier side, will know what their raw material cost is, or will estimate a raw material cost that they include in the quote when they prepare a quote for you. If there is any extra cost, they will make an estimate for that. They will estimate the tooling or fixturing. If they do not do some of the secondary processes in-house, if they have to send it out for paint, for example, they will get an estimate for that, either by using their own experience in a similar part, or by actually getting a quote from their sub-supplier. So they will typically have that. And obviously logistics costs are easy to separate because it is an item that they typically pay for separately as well. So at the bare minimum, you should be able to get that breakdown. aPriori actually gives you all this cost when you ask it to give you an estimate for the part. So on the one hand, you get the summarized part cost, which will give you things like material and labor and overhead and any tooling investment that may have been there, any logistics cost if you have it in your model, in your virtual model, and so on. And then it will give you also the detailed breakdown of all the processes and secondary processes if you have included those in aPriori. So if you had a machine casting, for example, you would get the cost of the die casting, and then if there was an extra inspection, what that cost was. Then if there was machining on top of that, then the machining cost as well. All right, so at this point, you have both. You have a breakdown of cost by the supplier and a breakdown of cost by aPriori. Again, I recommend that you confirm your routing, that you see if the process that is being used by the supplier to make the part is similar or the same as what aPriori is suggesting, because sometimes savings are indeed tied to the way that you make the part, the process that you follow for making the part, and that might be one of the areas that you might discuss with them. You should ask the supplier what secondary processes they conduct in-house versus which ones they get outsourced, because you want to find out how much of a premium you're paying for those processes which your supplier does not have the capability of doing themselves. So if they're sending the part out for paint or they're sending the part out for heat treatment, well, how much of a premium over and above what they're paying are you paying them? Is it as big as 50%? Because if it is that high, that is a pretty low-hanging fruit where you could easily negotiate that be taken down to something more reasonable, let's say 20%. Same thing for transportation. If they are paying for transportation for sending the parts out to and from the sub-suppliers, then yes, you need to pay for that because it's part of the cost, but you shouldn't be paying a high premium for that. Now, a small amount of premium is warranted because they do have to manage the sourcing of that secondary process, issue POs themselves, and so on, and track it, and so on and so forth. So there is some administrative cost, and you should be willing to give them some premium, but just not an excessive premium. Once you have cleared that, then it's time to investigate where your biggest differences are. Is your biggest difference in material? And if so, is it that they're paying a lot more for the material that you expected to be paying? Is it a case where the utilization may not be as good as you had expected, and then find out why, and so on and so forth? Right? Again, is it the material process? Is the manufacturing process different, and why is that? Is it that they only have this type of capabilities? Is it because they feel that the requirements of the part warrant this different process that they are following, and so on and so forth? What are the setup costs? Do the supplier know what the setup costs? So what kind of batch sizes are they running, and so on? Labor costs. Again, we talked about logistics, and if you can, sometimes you're able to even get all the way down to cycle times. So let's see some examples as to how this happens. I said a couple of times that it's important to find out how the supplier is making the part so you can compare it to what aPriori is suggesting, and then find out reasons as to why the discrepancies are there. In some cases, you'll find out that the supplier may only have a limited number of capabilities, and they may have been fine when your volumes were low, for example, but when your volumes go up, you may not be using the right supplier. So let's say that you have a part, and you started by purchasing maybe 1,000 parts a year, and it was okay to do it on a turret press when you're buying 1,000 parts a year. But now you're buying 15,000 parts a year. It's probably much better if you had a die and you stamp the part. And if that's the case, then offer to buy the die, offer to buy the tooling because it might be very well worth your while to make that investment. You may have to change suppliers. You may find out that, this supplier doesn't have the capabilities to provide you this part via an economic process because they just don't have that type of equipment. So there is an example on your right. This is a spacer that a company was buying and had been buying for over a decade. They were paying about $4.80 for the part. And they found out that the supplier was actually cutting that spacer from a bar and then machining the hole in the middle. And that's because at the time that that design first came out, that was the only way that they could meet the tolerances of the hole. A laser process at that time could not meet the tolerance of that hole. But by the time we got to work with the client and made an estimate, a priori estimated that that part should actually be made with a laser and should cost about 85 cents. The customer went back to the supplier and requested some requotes and had the part quoted at other suppliers as well. And as it turns out, the new quote that they went with was about 80 cents a part. And they was using a laser process. So here's a case where the a priori cost was 1/5 or less of what the part was actually costing, and our customer could have easily said, oh, that can't be right, and moved on. But because they took the time to figure out why the big cost difference, we were able to get a significant amount of savings in just this one part for them. Material cost. Like I said, sometimes you'll find that some of your biggest differences are in material cost. And they could be due to many, many things. For example, you may find out they're paying a lot more for the material, the raw material, than you expected. And in those cases, if you have the buying power that perhaps a smaller supplier may not have, you may offer to purchase the material and ship it directly to their factory. I know that when we sold parts to companies like, for example, GE or Air Liquide or Tri-Union, they would indeed buy the forgings for us and have the forgings sent to us because they could buy them at a much cheaper price. So it really is about trying to collaborate with your supplier and see what you can both do to bring your costs down. Right? In other cases, it's utilization. And if utilization is low, in some cases, you will have a part that has a low utilization. You want to inquire whether they are selling the scrap and whether you're getting any credit for that. In some cases, suppliers will give you credit for scrap, and in some cases, the suppliers won't. They may say it's already built into the cost of the material because they give you a discount up front, basically, on the cost per pound because they know they're going to get a certain amount per pound of scrap. But you want to have that conversation. This here is an example where a part is an extreme example of where the cost estimate that a priori generated would have suggested that the cost of the material was much lower. When we inquire with the supplier, as it turned out, the price of zinc had spiked. And obviously the virtual model hadn't caught up with that. But it was good because he highlighted the fact that perhaps this should be made out of a different material. And sourcing went back to engineering. They found an alternate material that they could use. It was aluminum because they had to redo the dies anyway, the casting dies. They decided to go with 2 cavities. So in the end, they ended up with a double productivity gainer. One was the material that was much cheaper per pound. And then the fact that they were producing 2 parts at once instead of 1 part per cycle. And that helped them essentially, between the 2 of those, it helped them reduce the cost of the part to about half of what they were paying. They were making a lot of this part, so it turned out that a very nice significant savings at the end of the year. Cost. This is often ignored, but it can be a source of very low-hanging fruit. If a priori highlights the fact that, hey, the setup cost for this part is a significant portion of the total cost, say 15, 20%, then It's worth investigating what batch sizes your supplier is making this part in. So we typically assume that the batch size is equal to the order quantity, but it may not be. So you should find out what that is. You should find out whether your supplier even knows what the setup costs are. Some suppliers don't break it down. It's part of their overhead. And if that's the case, ask. Show them that you are estimating that the cost of setting the part up is significant, and ask if they'd be willing to give you a reduction in price if you double or triple your order quantity. So if the savings associated with lowering your setup cost are much greater than your cost of carrying the inventory, by all means, do go ahead, double or triple your order quantity. In this part that you have in front of you here, we estimated that aPriori was between 15 and 20% of the cost of the part. We suggested to the customer that they indeed triple actually the order quantity, and that had the potential, just doubling it actually would have the potential of reducing the cost by 8%, which was much more than the carrying cost of inventory for that short period of time that the extra inventory gets carried. So the potential savings were essentially making a phone call with $12,000. Sometimes you find out that the supplier just misquoted, or that they quoted a part when you were buying very low quantities, perhaps as your first day of production, and the price never got changed. And so when you ask for a requote based on the estimate that aPriori gives you, supplier will come back and say, look, I'm sorry, you're right, it should cost a lot less, here's my requote. And this is exactly what happened with the part or the case study that you have on your right-hand side there. This was, again, the same trucking company. We had a stepper that is actually a battery cover that is used as a step to get into the cab. And when we looked at the estimate that aPriori provided for this part, aPriori suggested that it should cost around $22 and change. And the client was paying $40 for each one of these. When we approached the supplier came back and requoted the part at $27.50, which is a significant savings over what they were paying, and that provided a nice annual savings here. Again, please note that it is not important that the estimate is absolutely dead on what it should cost, but that it is a good ballpark number to target, a good ballpark number to shoot for, and help you save money. So the $27.50, although not as low as the $22.50, is significantly less than the $40 that the customer was paying. By the way, the story on this part is exactly what I mentioned before. The part had been quoted at $40 in the beginning when the volumes were very low, a couple hundred, and that price was adequate for that volume. The part got loaded into the system with the supplier at this cost, and as the volumes ramped up, the part never got requoted, and because you can't requote every part, it's just impossible. And so there is probably a lot of parts like this in the portfolio that you buy that have never bubbled up, and aPriori helps you bubble them up. So in summary, when you are dealing with parts that you currently buy and that they are identified as candidates for negotiation, you may indeed find in many cases that you are paying a fair price, even though aPriori says you should be paying less. But going through the process will identify ways to actually save money, because now you understand why the cost is what it is. Please note that in some cases, aPriori may say that you should be able to save 30 to 50%, when in fact you end up saving 15, 20, 30%. That's still significant. That's still significant. And that comes from negotiating with the fact that aPriori gives you. And please do not dismiss the cases where aPriori says that you should be paying much more less for the part, even if it's half or a third or a fourth, because in some cases that is reality and it's worth investigating. So let's move on to NPI parts. When you're sourcing NPI parts, you could have two different types. One is those parts where you have never purchased before. It's not similar to anything that you ever done before, so it's truly a brand new part. And in a lot of cases, it is the new part is simply a modification of an old part. It's either a little bigger or a little smaller, or it has an extra bend here, or a few extra holes, but essentially it is very similar to an old part. So let's take each one of these cases separately. When you're putting a completely new part, many companies, depending on the complexity of the part, the criticality of the part, may work with strategic suppliers. And in some cases, even if it's a new part, if it's simple enough and considered low risk, you might actually just send it out for bid like you would any other part. Regardless of which of these two strategies you follow, we recommend that you start by costing the part in aPriori and confirm your estimates. And you'll hear me say this over and over again because I want you to be more certain of the number that you're using. And so it is important that you make sure that you did have the right volume, the right batch size, the right factory, any secondary processes that you needed to add were added, and so on and so forth, the right material, and so on. So once you run the part through aPriori, getting an estimate, you confirm that everything is as it should be. For NPI parts, you may want to account for risk. Many suppliers, rightly so, will add a little extra cost beyond the estimate is for the part because they've never made the part before. And it's a part that not only they haven't made, nobody else has made. So they don't know what they're going to find along the process. And so they add a little cost for risk, and that is very warranted. It is a risk that the supplier is taking, and you should compensate them for that. So always keep in mind that maybe you should add a few percentages for risk. We recommend that you then send the part out for bid, either to your strategic supplier or out for an open bid to multiple suppliers without a target price. And understand what capabilities the supplier has to make this part and which capabilities are required. And that you ask, obviously, for a price breakdown right out of the gate. So once you get the quotes back, you should compare some of the top items. You should compare the material cost to what the aPriori estimate is for the cost, and then adjust the aPriori cost down if the average quote comes back with a lower material cost. And this is, again, because the part's never been made before, and it may be a part that is, for example, if it's a sheet metal part, it may be a part that is very good to dynamically nest with other parts, and so the utilization that you are calculating may be lower than the suppliers are calculating, because in fact they can fit parts in gaps that with parts that are being made for other clients. So that's just one example, but the point is that adjust the price in aPriori accordingly. Similarly, if you find that there is a process that you didn't expect was present, but it's required, then you need to add that to aPriori to adjust the price accordingly. So now you have an adjusted aPriori price, and you have a set of quotes, assuming that this was sent out for an open bid. So if you have multiple quotes and you have a quote that is indeed lower than what aPriori estimated, even after adjusting the aPriori prices, your lowest quote is lower than aPriori, then you should use that lowest quote as your target price, obviously. And obviously, you need to make sure that the supplier is a viable supplier that is qualified to make the part, that they understand what goes into making the part, and so on and so forth. But obviously, that becomes your target price. If not, then aPriori becomes your target price. So if the a priori cost is your lowest cost estimate, then that is your target price, and you will send the package out as best and final to perhaps 2 suppliers, maybe 3, but typically we recommend your top 2 suppliers with that target price. And one or two things will happen. They'll either come in at your target price or somewhere close to it, in which case it's a success, or they might give you a reduction in price, but not come anywhere near the target price that you had hoped for. And in that case, then you go back to what we talked about in fact-based negotiations. And now you have the price breakdown from the suppliers because you asked for it ahead of time. You compare to what aPriori has, and you follow the process that we talked about earlier on in the presentation. If you're working with a strategic supplier, then you use the aPriori estimates to establish the basis for your open book discussions. So at that point in time, you send the request for a quote to your supplier, you request the breakdowns of the cost, and then you just go through each line item and see where the discrepancies are and use that to spur the conversation on how you can lower costs. You may want to give your strategic supplier credit for a learning curve. So in other words, suppliers, like I said before, when they have never made a part before, and especially if it's a risky part to make, they will want some extra money for what could happen wrong. And what is typically done with the strategic suppliers is that you apply what we call a learning curve. And that means you give them some extra cost the first year, and then you give them a little less extra cost the second year, and maybe hopefully by the third year they will work the kinks out of the process of making the part, and they should be able to give you a more steady cost. In some cases it's done by volume, the first 100 parts at this price, the next 100 parts at that price, and so on and so forth. But that is a common practice that aPriori will not have included in their model unless you created a specific NPI model and included this cost in. Your goals, as always, are to understand what is driving the cost and then explore ways to reduce that cost. In some cases, suppliers will give you ideas on how to re-engineer the cost out of the part, and that's why we suggest that you have engineering present when you're going through this process of exploring what's driving cost for the part. What happens if the part is not a completely clean sheet, brand new part, but is a modification of an old part? Well, in this case, things become simpler. The process that we suggest you follow in using aPriori to deal with this type of parts is to cost the old part in aPriori. So you take the old design, the old model, you run it through, you get a cost. Then you cost the new part, the new model in aPriori. You again make sure that all or most of the secondary processes are present in both cases. And then you take the difference between those two, so the difference between what the estimate is for the old part and what the estimate is for the new part, and you apply that percent difference to the price that you pay the supplier today, and that becomes your target price. And it should be a fairly firm target price. So, for example, let's say that you have a part that is a modification, maybe slightly bigger than an old one, and you will run the old part to aPriori, and it comes out at $10. And then the new part, when you run it through aPriori, the estimate comes out at $12. So the difference between the two is 20%. Now you go back to what you're paying the supplier for the old part, and it's $10.50. And, so you don't worry too much about the 50 cents. It could be part of their profit margin, part of other things that get lost in the estimating process. But the point is you would multiply the 1050 by 1.2. You would come up with $12.60, and $12.60 is what you should be willing to pay that supplier for the new part. Now, in some cases, not as simple as that, but in most cases, that should be a very firm target price. And in the cases in which it's not, then again, you use fact-based negotiations to figure out why the difference and what can be done about it. So I'll give you an example. We have a customer that was buying a shaft for a flywheel, and they had an old design that cost, and I'm just going to make general numbers here because I can't use the real numbers, but let's just say that the old shaft was costing $50, and the new shaft, which was slightly bigger, was costing nearly $100, when aPriori said it should only be $60. So in discussions with the supplier, using this line of thinking of, wait a minute, this is very similar to the old part. It's only slightly bigger, but it's nearly twice the cost. Why is that? Well, it turns out that the old part, the diameter that was specified for the old part was very close to a standard size forging that the supplier could buy, and therefore it required very little machining to get it to the actual size, and there was very little material wasted. When they went to the new part, the diameter was such that they needed to go to one step higher on standard forgings, and so not only they were paying for more material that they needed to pay, they were paying for a lot more machining on that shaft. So the client indeed went back. It turns out that lowering the diameter of the shaft by 18 millimeters, just 18 millimeters, would be able to fit it within very close to a standard size forging, and they brought the cost down. They simply added the weight to another component on the flywheel because they did need the weight, which was a lot cheaper to add the weight in another component. And so they ended up with a cost much closer to what aPriori has suggested. So this is a case where aPriori suggested this, you should only be willing to pay, let's say, $60 for this part. The part was nearly $100. And the use of aPriori spurred the conversation and hence arriving at a much lower cost. So in conclusion, I think we have seen here today that aPriori helps you identify where you may find savings and about how much the savings should be. Not exactly, but it gives you a very good idea of a ballpark number that you should be targeting. It helps you place your purchases with the right suppliers by helping you identify what capabilities are needed to make the components that you're sourcing, and then looking for those capabilities within your supply base. aPriori helps you collaborate with your suppliers by focusing your negotiations in the areas in which you may actually be overpaying, and the supplier will have room to give you savings. And to do this, we have seen how aPriori can give you detailed cost data that can help you focus on those areas where the most opportunities are. Thank you very much, and have a great day.